COVID-19, a tragedy for humanity, but boom time for online learning?
A huge spike in activity levels.
Though, has it really gone that smoothly for LearnTech vendors? And what about their clients? How well has L&D been coping with the crisis?
Somebody paraphrased something to me where they said, we've spent 3 weeks planning to roll out some training on how to use Zoom to people that are running Zumba classes on it in the evening.
Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now, guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
When will this dam break, we used to ask each other? When will people finally get digital learning?
The dam's broken, and you and I have been having this conversation for 20 years, right, about when that dam was really going to break. But I think in one fell swoop, COVID has done that.
My guest on the Learning Hack podcast this time is David Wilson, founder and CEO of Fosway, Europe's #1 HR Industry Analyst. And as he says, the two of us have been talking about digital learning for quite some time. Now Fosway has released research into how COVID-19 is changing learning, and I wanted to get David's in-depth view, because according to him, this truly is a breakthrough moment for learning tech. But hang on to your hats. We're in a time of tumultuous change, with as much risk as opportunity for everyone. So how are you going to make sure you come out of this in one piece? David has good advice for L&D professionals and their vendors as we negotiate the tricky waters out of lockdown.
First off, can I get a quick reaction to the recent news about Skillsoft filing for Chapter 11? Some think it's to do with Skillsoft's own problems. I know that's Donald Clark's views, while others suggested it might be the canary in the coal mine. Where do you stand on that question? Should we expect to see more business failures among vendors in the wake of the pandemic, or is this a one-off?
I think Skillsoft's situation is to do with Skillsoft, generally. And in fact, it's probably more to do with Charterhouse, which was the private equity firm that owned them. And so my understanding, and I'm not a financial analyst, so I'll give you a nice caveat around that right up front, but my understanding is effectively having acquired Skillsoft, Charterhouse effectively, like a lot of private equity stuff, and we've seen this in other parts, retail and everything else, then immediately sort of loads it with lots of debt and basically takes its kind of money back out to some degree and ends up running Skillsoft with lots of debt in the background, and clearly it had an aggregate debt about 2.1 billion. I think my kind of reading is they got to, they're churning a lot of, I think the business has been profitable. It's difficult to judge that, right? Because obviously it's not public domain, the information, but it was servicing a large debt amount. They hit COVID. I think they had repayments they had to make during that period, weren't able to do it, and effectively had to therefore take an alternative path, which ended up with them going into Chapter 11. So I think it's a fairly well-trodden path of financial re-engineering to some degree, which is around, so effectively 96% of the equity in the business is owned by the first lien bondholders or whatever they're called, right? So they, the people that maybe have the largest amount of debt. I mean, how much value has been written off in that process? Obviously, effectively, Charterhouse has maybe handed the keys back in some ways and let the people that it had borrowed money. And obviously, those companies have now ended up effectively owning the business. And obviously, I assume will look to drive a return for that ownership. They may well have written off value in that process as well. I mean, that tends to happen in these kinds of situations. So I think on overall, the specifics related to Skillsoft, I think, are quite associated with their ownership and debt situation. And it's quite explicit if you look at the Chapter 11 documents that were posted, that was the real goal, is obviously to write down that debt and to effectively hand over ownership to their main things. How much this is a reflection? So the other part of your question, which I think is also hugely relevant, is this also an indication of what's going on in the broader market? So Skillsoft specifically isn't, I don't think, because of that particular situation.
Yeah.
However, obviously, we've also seen an impact into the digital learning companies and other things as well. Some of that impact is actually obviously incredibly positive, right? So the activity levels, I'm sure we'll talk about this, have massively spiked under the COVID era. But obviously it's also impacting projects, cash flow and other things. I think, we talk to a lot of vendors in the EMEA market, particularly, obviously, and some of those are global. We've certainly seen in some parts of the spectrum, some of the vendors, particularly in the US, actually, where they haven't kind of got the same furlough model operating, where they have actually laid off staff. But I think the majority we've seen have either, I've kind of optimized a bit and tried to retain cash and maybe furloughed some staff, if that, and some haven't done anything at all. I mean, I've done a couple of conversations even yesterday where people are just sort of, they saw a bit of a blip, but actually it's carrying on. So no, I'm not sure. I think it's a broader thing. However, there's no doubt that on a broader economic basis, there will be a significant impact in that business-to-business arena. Although, as I've said on multiple occasions now, basically we're in a world where unless you're digital, you're nowhere, right? So effectively the drivers to do more of this stuff that we're going to be talking about are a lot higher. But it still means maybe if you were running a business that was burning quite brightly, if I can put it like that, you were on a very high growth thing, then I think some of those companies will definitely have realigned some of that cost and spend. But whether it's an existential moment for them is, I think, debatable. We haven't seen any other big signs of that. But obviously, Skillsoft is arguably the biggest content provider in the market globally. Certainly in the digital side, that's a massive thing to have happened.
Yeah. But at the back of that, it's not necessarily the case that L&D people should be doing extra due diligence on their suppliers in case they suddenly fall over. We're not in that kind of nervous state. In my impression, we mainly deal with corporate buyers and they always do financial due diligence on their suppliers anyway. I'm sure they will be asking additional questions around it, but I don't see there's any particular. I think you just need to look at maybe the profile of that supplier in terms of where they relatively are. There are clearly some that are on as I said, they're burning brightly. They're on a big growth thing. They're over-investing in sales and marketing. And I think we'll expect to see some realignment around it. Generally, it's impacting that more than R&D, if you like, in terms of, where the spend is going. And also on things like service delivery type resources and so on as well. I think the other side of this is, we're talking about purely digital businesses. If you've got a hybrid training company, I think that's a much different story. So, obviously, so Henry from Happy Computers put out a LinkedIn statement about, their situation, and obviously, going from how they trying to rebuild revenue, having gone from a situation where they were nicely profitable, very stable, really nice business, and overnight 85% of their revenue was turned off. And that kind of statement. So I think if you're in a business that has a much heavier face-to-face delivery model as part of it, or then that obviously is much more of a game changer. Obviously, there's a lot of unsureness about at the moment, a lot of change in the environment. As you say, some people get an uptick, other people find clients dropping out and whole revenue streams disappearing. With that in view, you've recently unveiled initial results of your research into how COVID-19 is changing learning. Would you like to summarize the key findings of that research?
Yes. So first of all, a bit of context on it. One of the reasons we did it was because we felt we should. So obviously we're an analyst and research firm. That's what we kind of do. And obviously we talk to lots of parts of the market, corporate buyers and vendors, etc. And actually, our original thing that we looked at was more in HR, where we were seeing HR functions being asked questions by their board based on what the government was announcing the night before. So it was really, really fluid situation. And nobody really had a clue what was going on. And I felt that actually we were probably having individual conversations thinking there's a clear pattern here. So we did something on that side of it. And obviously for us, we do a lot of stuff in the learning market. And it was very obvious that with people home working, pretty much the digital delivery was the only game in town. And therefore we were seeing a huge spike in activity levels in terms of usage of platforms and things like this from every angle, right? Whether you talk to corporates or vendors or whatever, there was a huge spike around it. But the other side of this was what were they really doing, and et cetera, and so on, trying to understand how this was actually impacting the broader strategy. So we certainly focused on trying to really sort of, I guess, unpick that a little bit more and understand how it was sort of really impacting kind of learning at an overall level. So first of all, it was blindingly obvious. Nobody needed to do research to understand it had a massive impact, right? So, but actually, what was the patterns underneath that? And also then really trying to get a sense of what was effective or what wasn't. I mean, somebody paraphrased something to me where they said, we've spent 3 weeks planning to roll out some training on how to use Zoom to people that are running Zumba classes on it in the evening.
Yeah.
Right. So there was a kind of paradox between what was going on in the household, and there were people using these platforms for everything, towards where companies were around it as well. So I think there were some things underneath that. So some there's some quite key headlines obviously around this. I mean, first of all, there's massive impact overall. 94% of companies are kind of are saying that there's big changes around it. The adoption, of digital learning, even the kind of, we've been talking about this for 20 years. Obviously, in most companies, it wasn't necessarily a mature channel for them, right? So we're seeing big growth around that, massively higher demand. On a company level, we've seen 70% increases in demand for digital learning resources and so on. I think a big factor here is speed. Again, I was doing a conversation yesterday with somebody that said they had to take a whole induction process and reskilling process that was all done face-to-face and deliver it, and effectively have to re-engineer it and deliver it in literally a few days on a digital. So speed, the speed of change here is huge. In terms of specific areas, things like video and curated content are the highest areas of activity in terms of things. Interestingly,
did that surprise you? Do you think? Was that a surprise?
No, actually, it didn't, because I think first of all, there is a bit of there's a kind of a zeitgeist moment, right? So that effectively companies used to be very reserved around use of video, but it's been for the last 4 years maybe in our digital learning realities research, it's been one of the highest areas of growth. And I think the key thing around, video is it's fast to record and fast to deploy, right? So I think it's something associated with being agile. The other things I would say is obviously what we've seen on the vendor side is lots of vendors basically make available things like COVID portals and resources and other things as well, right? So sometimes, this can be accelerated through stuff that your vendor is enabling, because they're obviously trying to get creative around and basically be as helpful, I think genuinely be as helpful as they can be. Interestingly, the other end of the spectrum is, what hasn't been, hasn't really been kind of adopted. So off-the-shelf courses, so, the traditional kind of catalog actually is relatively low in terms of the thing. It's sort of mid-level in terms of the spectrum of activity. But actually, it's one of the highest areas, one of the areas where the lowest proportion of people have said it's actually really useful. So I think think what we've seen is a more targeted response with people trying to leverage, as I say, things like some video content, curated assets and things that they can use, that kind of approach quickly, because it's maybe easier to consume and easier to kind of deploy out. And one of the questions, as I said, it's not just about activity here. I mean, many of the vendors are talking about multi-100% increases in activity levels on their platforms. I mean, you're seeing some of them talk about, some of that data publicly.
The initial months or initial weeks of this, what we heard was that catalogue sales are up and catalogue inquiries are going up, and it looked like people were lurching towards a very traditional model of, e-learning modules and LMS. But actually, your research contradicts that. But the question you ask is what's been effective, not what you adopted.
Yeah. Well, and even if we're looking at what we adopt, there is a significant increase. There are some significant differences. So as I said, video and curated content are the highest by a reasonably high margin. Micro-learning is an area people are finding useful. So I would say in terms of new approaches, that's an area that seems to have resonated strongly. But the off-the-shelf side is, noticeably below that in terms of its kind of an overall adoption level, but also a higher proportion of people that saying it's not particularly useful, right? So, or not that successful for them, which I think is an interesting thing. From a platform perspective, and I'm sure we'll come on and talk about this a bit later on, but, things like, it's not all about the LMS, although LMS is on the list of some of the most successful platforms still, but things like, the LXP, the Learn Experience platform, obviously virtual classroom is probably the biggest one, the go-to thing in the terms of, and that's kind of interesting because we've seen in the background a renaissance, I think, around the virtual classroom stuff. Again, it's been relatively high on the growth adoption area. So I think it's maybe something which had already found its time a little bit. Yeah. And then obviously under the COVID situation with people working from home, it was one of the areas where, again, we saw kind of huge growth very fast, and hence the comments about, the Zoom, using Zoom and training people how to use virtual sessions and so on. Yeah. I think one of the challenges will be, and probably actually, before I say that, one of the other kind of key things is so the genie's out the bottle, right? I think a lot of the barriers to pushing things online or pushing everything online rather than just selective things, rather than just the compliance content and the stuff that maybe some people in L&D historically have felt was more easy to deliver or less important, if you like, to hold on to from a face-to-face, right? Yeah. Those barriers have been completely obliterated. Unless it's happening online, it isn't happening at all at the moment. And I think the question then is, will the genie go back in the bottle, right? So will we go back to that? And I think that's a really, really, really interesting. So that, we're seeing is nearly 70% of companies saying definitively no, having made this shift, that, the strategy going forward will not go back to what it was like before, the mix and so on and things like this. So I think the dam's broken. It doesn't mean that we will go. I mean, we absolutely, I'm sure, will go to replace or add in higher value face-to-face interventions and other forms of learning activity at some point. But that is going to be a much more selective process still than it was historically. And you and I have been having this conversation for 20 years, right, about when that dam was really going to break. But I think in one fell swoop, COVID has done that.
I've worked with a lot of companies in learning technologies, but there are none I would recommend as wholeheartedly as Learning Pool. They have some of the most leading-edge, award-winning tech around, but also an approachable, honest style that means they're equally at home helping people take their first steps in digital learning. They're great with organisations small and large. They do platform, content, authoring, analytics and more, and have a 98% customer satisfaction rating. So if you have a problem to solve or an opportunity you need a can-do partner to help you make the most of, go to learningpool.com.
I think it's fair to say you've been a bit of a skeptic as far as LXPs are concerned. But the figures here seem to show that has been quite widely adopted, in fact. And clearly the crisis has accelerated change in our industry to a degree. Will the way this research has turned out change the way that you view the platform market at all, you think? So in other words, we've all been through a big change. We've seen a change of mindset over what can be accomplished in online learning because people have had to do it. On the other side of that, though, has it changed your view of the market when you see the popularity of newer forms and LXPs and so on in this research?
No. I mean, in simple terms. So it wasn't, you're absolutely right. You could kind of say that we're a skeptic around LXP. Actually, we're not a skeptic at all around, I think, what the LXPs are trying to do, or the things that are within LXPs to disrupt learning and to move it into different directions. And it's not a singular direction. We've been very skeptical about is the LXP term and the real value it derives. So, and in our 9-grid analysis for learning systems, which is now one of the main market analysis globally, not just in EMEA, for looking at learning solutions, we in February basically blew the whole thing up and said, look, we're not going to talk about LMSs and LXPs. We want to talk around learning system suites, which are things trying to manage and deliver, support pretty much be the backbone across most of the forms of modern learning, not just traditional learning, as sometimes kind of people want to say. And then we'll talk about learning system specialists, which are people trying to be disruptors in some part of that spectrum. And historically, the LXPs have been disruptive plays, right? They've not tried to be the LMS. They've tried to be something on top of the LMS or separate to it, or etc. We've been tracking this for an awful long time. When we introduced the classification, I think 4 years ago, we talked about next-gen learning environments. Yep. And at that point, we chose not to talk about LXPs because, frankly, I thought it was more hype than reality, right? And actually, interestingly, we'd already looked the year before at doing it and decided not to do it because we didn't think corporates were really buying these things and vendors were capable of really supporting corporate clients other than on a pilot basis. What we've seen, of course, happen over that whole period, and I'd argue from an analyst point of view, we've probably drilled into this more than any analyst firm globally has. So again, not just in EMEA. And what we've seen is that in the reality is you see two basic patterns in the in the large enterprise market, where companies have got LMS platforms and multiple LMSs, and they're using it to run their compliance and their face-to-face training and et cetera, et cetera. They're very complex companies, and most of the time they're trying to consolidate actually still onto less platforms because they've probably still got multiple ones. But changing that's like changing the direction of a super tanker, right? It's really, really kind of difficult to do. And if you're driving the compliance agenda for a 100,000 person company across 38 countries or something, you don't mess around with that lightly, right? Because companies can't be less compliant than they were before. So all those drivers for LMSs are all still there. Yeah. But effectively, we moved the agenda and started focusing on new stuff, right? We wanted to worry about the learner experience, and we wanted to worry about, new types of content and synthesizing it, microlearning and video and all this kind of stuff. So, effectively, we'd implemented LMSs to do one job, and then we were trying to judge them by a different lens, okay? And funnily enough, they didn't stand up that well, even though that noise level is overstated. The LXP piece then came in as an incremental layer. And the thing we got very skeptical around was how much the LXPs were really around learning experience, right? Because we talk about learning experience platforms, but actually, when you actually lift the lid even vaguely, what you realize is most of them are nothing to do with learning experience. They're just a different modality, if you like, of learning. So it's a micro-learning platform, or it's an adaptive learning platform, or it's a mobile learning platform, or whatever.
Different way of delivering content, and
it's just a different approach. It's a different thing, and I'm not trying to
content. Yeah.
Well, it's not just that, John. I think it's that they were. So what we found and believed quite strongly, and we have at various points in the journey questioned that to say, should we add LXP as a classification, for example? But the more we looked at it, the more we were convinced that actually it was just marketing, right? It was just a bunch of marketing bullshit, if I can put it, pardon my French on that, right? And effectively any company that didn't want to be position themselves as an LMS described themselves as an LXP, regardless seemingly of what they did, right? So what we wanted to do was to question that. So our cynicism, if you like, around it is actually, what is, why are people describing this? What is it they're actually doing? So the whole point, and I appreciate the learning systems specialist is a very unsexy term to describe somebody as, but what it does is it punctures all the hyperbole around, oh, we're a learning experience platform, and it enables us to ask a very basic question, which is, what is it you actually do? Right? So don't tell me you're an LXP. Tell me what it is you're actually focusing on doing. Tell me what's differentiated. And when you have that conversation, what you find is you get a much more productive kind of focused discussion about what they're actually doing. And it's really interesting, right? We're not puncturing it because we're saying it's unimportant. We're puncturing it because what we're saying is it's confusing everybody. Yeah. Now, interestingly, when we did that announcement, and we've actually looked at this in other spaces, like in talent acquisition and so on, other markets, we announced it, but we decided that we thought for learning, this was really important to do it, because we went to Learning Technologies in London in February, you walked around the room and there's all these bloody LXP stories and everything else. And we know that corporates are interested. As I said, I forgot my one part of the story. I said in the enterprise market, the large enterprise market, these things are typically incremental. They're adding them on top of LMSs. But if you're a mid-market customer, you don't want to have multiple systems. You haven't got resources to integrate them together. Typically, they want a one-stop shop. So one of the things that really separates in some ways is larger enterprises, it's too complicated to build a full capability thing and be disruptive in certain places whilst changing one core underlying application. So what they do is they build a patchwork and an ecosystem, and learning technology has always been about that, an ecosystem. In the mid-market, though, they want to simplify that, and they want typically they want a suite type scenario. So what was happening, and we saw this, is most of the LXPs building out LMS functionality because their mid-market customers needed them to also do launch and track of compliance content, or even basic classroom training management and stuff like this. So when you look at the big, what I would call the poster child for the LXP story, so historically there were three originally that you talked about, which were Degreed, PathGather, and Edcast in the US. And then you have someone like Fuse making a lot of noise in the UK market and so on. And now there's a whole plethora of them, right? When you look at these, actually a majority of them are really trying to be suites, not specialists, but they're trying to be suites with a different orientation. They're not really LXP. So the discussion, that recategorization is designed for one very simple purpose, which is to help corporates understand what it is they actually want, right? We get lots of them. We see a lot of interest, and you said the data has kind of confirmed that these things are it's less of a catalog-driven approach to how some of this content gets access, curated content and stuff gets access to people. That LXP type story makes sense, right? So it's not that we see these as being a negative, not important or anything, but what we're trying to do is to give corporates the tools to actually understand what it is they want to buy. Because 2/3 of the companies that come to us, we get a lot of corporates come to us because they're confused, right? And they want help they want help in understanding and validating their understanding. When you ask them who they've been looking at and you ask them what their need set is, it's clearly that they really don't understand what these things are able to do. They can get very influenced by an individual vendor conversation. And if they're a big company and got multiple stakeholders who are having multiple of those, they end up with a whole basket case with no clarity at all. And the more they look, the worse they get.
obviously there is a lot of marketing bullshit, as you say, around LXPs and so on. But is what you're saying that fundamentally, when you looked at what LXPs were doing, they're not doing anything different to LMSs?
No, that's not what I said. So what LXPs are typically doing is they are trying to identify within a narrower scope what we call a disruptive specialism, right? So they're coming at this going like, we're an adaptive learning platform, right? And we can do that better than anybody else. And adaptive learning is really important. And if that is your bag and what you're looking to do, we can do that job a lot better than an LMS will ever be able to do, right? Because they don't really support it. What you've got is, obviously, this is always a moving target. So what's happening is the suite vendors also are trying to have LXP functionality, and every vendor has an AI story, and everybody now wants to be able to support video content and the curated model. Every vendor wants to be the Netflix of learning, quote, right? I mean, if ever you see me present, I focus a lot on this stuff. It's not, it's meaningless statements a lot of the time. But the reality is some people just do bits of that better, right? And if that bit that they do better is really relevant to how you're trying to transform your learning thing at this point in time, you can get a disproportionate benefit. So one of the things that when you look at the definition of specialist, it says that they typically are focusing on one area, maybe one or a couple of areas within the whole story, and they are trying to do that with a disruptive play that generates a transformational outcome. And that's why when you've seen it in the large enterprise type scenario, companies look to this and go like, actually, like the learning model that we run through our LMS and catalog is not great. What we want to do is we want to change that, and we want to add a curated content layer, and we want to make personalized recommendations to people. Right. So what we are saying from Fosway point of view, and I validated this with all the vendors as well, right? Because the vendors, they see this. They're on the other side of all these RFPs that go out for an LXP. That when you read them, it's quite clear that people don't really know what they're looking for, right? And what we're trying to do is sort of puncture the marketing hyperbole and say, stop telling me it's a new categorization or whatever it is. Just telling me what your focus and area of disruption is and what you're trying to really do. And if that now aligns with, for me as the buyer, what I'm trying to do, that's a really good fit, and I really want to look at you. The other thing, we've got a project we're doing at the moment to really build on this. So although we've been in the market tracking things for 24 years, we are currently engaging in what possibly is our biggest single research project ever, which is to dive into all these specialisms and almost like deconstruct the whole thing and really understand what they're about and build a way of looking at them that A, helps corporates understand what they are trying to buy, but B, holds every vendor to account for how good they are at doing it. Right. Okay. So in other words, we're building, if you like, functional assessment and detailed things that we can then play back, not just against the specialists, who are the ones that you would hope would be better at that stuff, but also against the LMSs and suites and so on and things like this, to understand how much better the specialists really are. Because that is the fundamental thing. If you've got a large system and you're running, Saba and Cornerstone or Docebo or Calidus or whatever it is, Talentsoft or 360 Learning or whatever the thing is, should I, are these, if I want to do just one part of this really disruptively, am I better off sticking with my suite vendor, or should I buy something else as well? Because you can pretty much guarantee the suite vendor will have part of that story as well. Right. So just the question is, are they any better? So that's what, for us, being skeptical about LXP is not being skeptical about the things under LXP. It's more about it as a marketing and buying term.
About the way it's sold.
And trying to create, and what is being bought, frankly, as well, because I think there's a lack of understanding, a lack of maturity in understanding around what companies are actually trying to do, and also how the jigsaw fits back together again, right? So the other part of this is, if you blow it up and you end up with multiple components, what is the learning technology ecosystem that you're then doing, and how does that drive your future strategy? And by the way, this is not a learning only issue. You've got people like Workday and SuccessFactors and Oracle out in the HCM space, also influencing the way that ecosystem looks. So yeah, it's a very kind of thing. But I would say from a corporate perspective and corporate strategy perspective, it's probably emerging as one of the biggest topics ever, and it's a lot more complex and nuanced than how do I launch and track e-learning content to my user base, right? Which was actually a relatively lowest common denominator activity in many cases.
Well, I suppose what makes it difficult is that when you're looking at the differences between these specialist systems and, as you say, the big suites based in kind of administration functions, it's not necessarily just about here's this one kind of breed of machines with a certain feature set and functionality set, and here's these others with a different feature set. There's also a difference of approach, ideology, perhaps. One of the big things that comes in with the learning experience platform is a focus on UX and user experience. The marketing rhetoric, let's call it, would say that this is a more learner-focused view, as it expressed through the design of these things, than an admin-based view. So I can see there are a lot of things kind of in play there. But when you're kind of stripping out the marketing bullshit, so to speak, it's very difficult not to avoid using that word. Now you've raised it. I think it's going to change the rating of this episode. But what is it that's stripped out? What is it essential that is under? I suppose, in other words, what I'm saying here is, are we talking about a change from one paradigm to another, which is kind of gradual, piecemeal, and incremental? Or is it really just one thing, the learning system evolving to a new place? And really, although we may not seem to, and there's a lot of arguments about it, we're actually moving in the same direction altogether.
I think it's more multidimensional than it was before. I mean, this has always been true, right? If I go back 15, 20 years ago, we had things which were called training management systems, and then things which were called learning management systems or e-learning management systems, right? And what happened was we realized that this was all part of a continuum, and that it would be an awful lot better if we had a platform that was actually pretty good at managing both, right? Yeah. Not least because the ones that were managing training were often pretty awful, and it was all a back-end administration system. There was no way of actually making that available to the end learner. So this has been it's been a multi-layered landscape for a long time. I think what's happened is we're now looking at it going, as well as all of that kind of story, we now want to be able to support video and mobile and micro learning. And we'd be really interested if we had adaptive learning content. And what about if we used a machine learning recommendations engine to personalize the interface? And could we make the content actually adaptive so that it's the content that changes rather than just the recommendations of the content that you get? And right? So this has become very fragmented and much more diversified, and that's called modern learning, right? Modern learning is about all of that stuff, and collaboration and social and everything else. So what is happening? So to some degree, you're right. What we're seeing is, we are seeing a natural evolution of what learning used to only be about classroom, and then it became about classroom and e-learning, launched through an AICC tracking type kind of vehicle or whatever, or then SCORM and so on. Right. Remember, I go back this to ancient history because we've been looking at it for so long and so deeply. Yeah. And now what's happened is that the number of learning channels and the components and the types of things have just exploded. So some things are natural evolution to support more of that. But what I would argue, at any point in that journey, if your focus as a buyer, as a corporate learning function, is around really, transforming or disrupting a particular part of that story, right? Then what you've tended to do is buy a best-of-breed application to do it, and then realize over time that maybe, the suites catch up, and then you can then use the suite instead, or you buy a new suite that does all of what you did on the old suite, plus this new stuff as well. That's just the reality of what happens. Some of those suites, though, turn out to become, some of those players turn out to become the biggest player. So the biggest learning management or learning technology company now in the corporate training market is now Cornerstone, after the acquisition of Saba. Cornerstone wasn't one of those big systems in the past, right? It came in and disrupted some of the legacy enterprise LMS leaders and then became the leader itself, right? So within this, you've got this journey happening that, as I said, the whole thing around the LXP thing is not that the functions and the capabilities, the types of things, the types of disruptive capabilities underneath it are not relevant and important. They are. It's, does LXP exist as a singular thing? Is it a meaningful thing for a company to be thinking about buying, or is it actually confusing them about what it is? If I turn around and said that anybody that didn't want to be seen as a traditional LMS was marketing themselves as an LXP, it becomes a meaningless term. So all we're doing is kind of blowing apart almost that hyperbola layer around it and saying, just focus, tell us what you really do, right? And show us how you do that differently. And if companies are clearer in asking those questions to the vendors, it makes it easier for the vendors to align or evidence or also qualify themselves out, right? They can go, well, actually, that's not what we really do. Yeah. But the more that we're stuck with just a label around this that is just there for the sake of it, and it's there. I mean, Josh Bursin put the label pretty much on the market a few years ago, and when we looked at it, at the point when we looked at it and said, this doesn't actually really make sense, and we've not fundamentally changed our idea on that. What we've done is try to come up with a better framework for actually saying, look, how do we make this disproportionately more important, but at the same time help simplify the language and understand what people are doing? So the whole point is we say it's a specialist, is go, well, what's your specialism? Right? It's just an obvious thing to say, oh, well, we're really, really good at mobile learning. Great. That's what I'm trying to buy. I've got this disconnected workforce, or these things, they're not sat at desks, they're not in this, etc. I've really just got to deliver all my stuff on there, because funnily enough, when you looked at most of the traditional LMSs, they just probably weren't that great at doing mobile learning. So if that's what you're buying, that's what you want to disrupt, if that's what you want to transform, that to me is a much more relevant, focused, clearer value proposition, rather than just saying, oh, we're buying learning experience.
Help me understand this, though. Because I might be getting you wrong, but it's what you're saying there, that if you're not a suite, you have to have a distinctive specialization. Right.
Well, if you're not a suite, you have to have, I think probably, first of all, the majority of the learning platforms are effectively suites, right? But what they are historically, because they've typically been used to manage and administer and then provide a point of access, right? So that's where you talk about the learning experience around it, to something, right? And some of them are very, very e-learning focused. Some of them have been social video learning platforms. Some of them whatever. So, but what they tend to, unless they're very focused on being a suite. So I'll give you an example in a UK company. Again, talking to them very recently. Filtered, right? Yeah. So Filtered has an AI recommendations engine, and they focus for the last few years on being very distinct around that. Now, that absolutely is a specialist, isn't it? It's focusing around how do you do intelligent learning, and the chances are it's going to be bolted into a bigger learning ecosystem, which will involve suites and other pieces as well, right? So, and what they're trying to do is differentiate and grow based on that as a strategy. So I would say I'm not sure do you have to be, but I would say by definition, anybody that isn't focusing on being a specialist is by definition trying to focus on being a suite. The question is, how good is their suite then, right? How much of what they do they cover? And that's about scope, and it's also about depth and sophistication of the capabilities. And there is absolutely, and another part of this lens to understand is that you can be really, really effective at doing stuff within like a mid-enterprise customer, in that 1 to 10,000 employee space. But there's a big step up to be able to do that on a global organizations with 50 different divisions.
Once you're multi-territory, it starts to get
and also the complexity of the organizational model, the back-end administration and management of that, the permissions and flexibilities, and you're almost virtualizing all of the processes to be able to support it. So, there are solutions out there that have been in that mid-market and hugely successful, right? But they're still covering most of the same scope as what maybe some of the big vendors are doing.
Okay, so that helps me to understand it in a way, because I think, so if you're an LXP and you say, okay, everybody has an ecosystem now, what we want to be is the front door to that ecosystem. That sounds like a very broad kind of thing, but in fact what you're doing is specializing in, if you like, the experience layer, the discovery layer.
Correct. So that's exactly right. So you can be a specialist in the experience layer. That is exactly right.
That's
if you look
why
at the 9 grid,
people
that's
talk about an experience layer.
Yeah,
okay.
But the majority of solutions that you're looking at that get put in that box do not do that. They are not trying to just be the experience layer. They are actually trying to be a part of the fulfillment, the pillars underneath it as well, right? So that's where the confusion comes in, and that's why it's a thing. There's another very important point, and when we're focusing, obviously, about this experience word. So we see the same thing in HR and the employee experience. We see the same thing in talent management with talent experience, right? To some degree, it's been trendy to put this experience word in and think it means something, right?
Yeah.
And because the reality is all of the vendors of all of the suites are also trying to improve their experience as well, right? This is a little bit in the eye of the beholder or about timing. Yeah, if you've got a massive investment in a huge system that's managed compliance training on a catalog, making that, even though that may have now the capabilities, right? These are cloud platforms mostly now, so it may have an experience type story of that it's had for a couple of years. You may have never turned it on, because it's not relevant to the way you've implemented it. So I think what we're trying to do is to identify, as I said, what is the area of disruption you're trying to focus on? So the way you described it is, I want to focus on the front-end experience, right? And does that mean but then the question is for whom, right? So is that for the learner, or is it for the learning as an activity? But this is not a straightforward thing, because the reality is the front-end experience layer for most organizations is never going to be controlled by L&D. Right, and this is what we're seeing in this broader landscape. So we're seeing, if I then step up and look at an HR and HCM level, what we've got is the HR vendors saying they are going to own the employee experience layer for all of the applications under HR, which includes in most cases learning, whether they're in their suite or outside their suite. And then arguably, probably on a company level, IT is going to say, well, we'll create we want to manage the experience layer for the whole company across all our applications, because there's this other big elephant in the room here. It's called the systems of work. Where do you do your day job, right? Because none of these do you do your day job in your LMS or in your LXP
and then
or whatever it is.
The conversation about integrations to Slack and Teams and
absolutely. And then again, that's come through from the COVID research. Again, I think 84% of L&D leaders sound now like saying now they get that, right? They want it to be part of Teams and part of Slack if they're running Slack, etc., or whatever it is as well. So that's also been, I think, the realization around that is, but it isn't just about those systems or integrating into that. It's also, what do you do as a company? If you're an insurance company, you do insurance broking and claims processing and everything else. If you're a software business, you design and build software. If you're a bank, you manage kind of financial transactions, whatever. Those are the systems of work, not just Teams and email and stuff like that. So yeah, I think there's a much bigger discussion to be having about who actually owns experience or can own experience.
On the back of that, what advice would you have for L&D coming out of lockdown, and also for vendors? There might be two very different questions, but maybe you can nail them.
So, I mean, first of all, I think for L&D, really, it's kind of blindingly obvious, but understand the reality of what's going on in your company more broadly. I mean, one of the things we always give advice to L&D, if you read any of our research, is around aligning to what's really going on in the business. Mm-hmm. It's amazing how much of L&D historically has been aligned with business as usual and what they've done in the past, rather than necessarily what the priorities of now or the future are. I think COVID again has kind of taken a big swipe out of a lot of that stuff, because you've had to focus on the necessary. And I think so. Number one is keep focusing on the necessary and focus on what in reality, align whatever we're trying to do and that future path and journey towards what fundamentally makes a bigger impact in the company and has a more important role in the company. Don't become an order taker for transactional learning again, right? Because that's, I think, a huge thing. Associated with that, the digital was always here to stay, but I think the evidence seems to be from the research that it will become even a lot more important in the overall model relative to where it was in the past. It's not just a way of delivering low value of compliance and training. You need to kind of grow up in some ways and understand how that's going to work. And I think the other side is, it's not just about sticking a bunch of an e-learning catalog online and making that effective. I think you've got to really think about a much broader model about what digital learning is really about, and maybe think about the skill sets you've got internally in the organization, realign yourself. The biggest thing that I think COVID has done beyond any doubt is made L&D much more agile. It's done things in days and weeks that it was taking months and years to do before. And I think can you bottle some of that so that you can keep being agile going forward? So I would say that probably overall, from a vendor perspective, I mean, first of all, keep the faith, right? So absolutely everything that, all the vendors we did, whether it's in learning, in HR, talent, recruiting, and so on, they're massively more relevant, and what they're trying to sell is more relevant to the future of companies than it was before, right? So that opportunity is absolutely there. I think the key thing from a corporate perspective, though, is how do you make it easier for them to engage faster? Time to value is a really big thing here. So how can you make it really easy for them to move their agenda forward, your customers, and lower the barriers to entry to enable you to do that? And also, frankly, be creative in where you look at that, from a pricing point of view, from a service engagement point of view. We've seen a lot of companies, a lot of vendors use this time when the wheels fell off the marketing engine, because it was all associated with big face-to-face industry events and user conferences and stuff. One of the things we've seen happen is not only everybody go digital, but we've also seen them focus on almost like simplifying and understanding what their value proposition, the go-to-market story. This is all your space, John, right? So there's been a lot of reflection and focus on that, I think. And I think that's the other side, is be clearer in what you really can do to people, and then sort of find easier ways for people to buy into that proposition, right? And then hopefully watch it thrive then and grow going forward. So I think from that point of view, those drivers will still be there. The big unknown for all of us is going to be second waves and further lockdowns and everything else. We don't know how that is, but I think I think it's unlikely. I don't know. I kind of listen to a lot, read a lot of stuff from an economic standpoint. We'll see a real V-shaped recovery from an economy point of view. I think there will be, obviously, in the broader space, lots of some furloughed staff will end up being laid off as well. That what proportion is unknown. But I think from a vendor perspective in this space, if you're a digital vendor, if you execute well, then I think that, if you saw a dip at all, because some haven't really, I think there's an opportunity. This is a growth opportunity, but you need to be maybe more creative around how you engage with it in order to accelerate. And as I said, time to value, I think, is a really critical thing. And there aren't many people that are going to probably in the current sign off really big, huge transformational projects with 2-3 year minimum delivery timescales on them. So how do you kind of deconstruct yourself to make yourself relevant to that?
Some really good advice there. Thank you very much, David Wilson.
Thanks, John.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast this time. Many thanks to David and the team at Fosway and to our sponsors Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsors. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice to get future episodes automatically. And if you're keen to help other people find us, please leave a glowing review and a 5-star rating. If you want to sponsor or give any feedback at all, you can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. Next time on The Learning Hack, we'll be rewilding L&D with Miles Runham. Miles has a fresh and innovative take on how learning and development people ought to reframe their purpose and priorities. Don't miss it. Bye for now.
Now I finally get it.